Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we ask which electoral system leads to the fairest representation for women? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. We're looking this week at the representation of women in parliaments. No democracy in the world has yet achieved equal representation for women in its national parliament. So it's important to understand what could be done to improve the situation. One long-standing idea is that some electoral systems may be better than others in enabling fairer representation. And a new article, co-authored by my colleague Dr. Eleanor Woodhouse, sheds fresh light on the issue. Ellie is lecturer in public policy here in the UCL Department of Political Science. Avid podcast listeners may recognise her from an episode last term, and I'm delighted to say that she joins me again now. Ellie, welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics. And let's start by saying a little more about the underlying issue that you're seeking to address here. How far away are we from equal representation for women today?
Hello, Alan. So thank you for having me back on the podcast. It's a pleasure. Yeah, so as you pointed out, we no democracy in the world has yet reached equal female political representation. And the same is true, in fact, for the gender gap more broadly. So, for example, data from the World Economic Forum and their Global Gender Gap Index shows that no country in the world has yet closed the gender gap. There are some that are becoming kind of closer, and this is across a range of different indices, so economic, educational, and political. Some are getting close, such as Iceland, Norway, and Finland, for example. And in the case of looking sort of purely at political representation, again, we have countries such as Iceland, Sweden, and Finland, and New Zealand, in fact, which now stands at 49.2% women's representation. But we still don't have a single democracy, as you note, in the world that has equal representation of men and women in our elected bodies. And in the lower house was the case that I was citing. So I would argue, as a woman and a person on this planet, it's important that we try and seek that type of equal representation and do so as broadly as possible and as soon as possible.
Great, thank you. So as I said, you're focusing particularly on the role that electoral systems might play in this. And let's again, before we get to your particular research, dig into our existing knowledge on this, if you like. So as I said in the intro, the argument that some electoral systems are better than others for women's representation has a very distinguished pedigree. Could you say a bit more about what we already know from that existing work?
Yes, of course. So as you say, it's a very rich and extensive literature, and I contribute only a very small recent part. So what has broadly been written about is essentially there's been kind of a broad exploration of the relationship between different families of electoral system and their relationship with women's representation more broadly. So if we're thinking about this in two kind of families of electoral system, so majoritarian, so thinking first past the post or winner takes all, as opposed to proportional representation systems. So I'm sure our readers are sort of broadly aware of what these two types of families of electoral rules do, but one essentially the electoral map is split into districts and individuals compete for those districts, and then whichever party wins the most number of districts becomes the leading party, right? So majoritarian systems. Whereas the kind of spirit behind proportional representation systems, or PR systems, is that you're going to have a share of seats that is reflective of the share of votes that you received. And so here we're usually talking about splitting up districts into a given number of seats, and then ideally you'd have, if a party receives 23% of the vote share, they would have 23% of the seats in Parliament. So the idea is there that you, rather than having this kind of heavy majoritarian bonus, you have a more equal and kind of diverse representation of parties elected to the lower house is the case that I'm talking about. So on the whole, there's broad consensus that essentially PR, so proportional representation systems, are associated with higher women's political representation. And that's precisely what in this paper, which is co-authored with Paola Profeta at Bocconi, we aim to look at. So I guess that's what we're going to be talking about next, but that's the kind of background to this paper.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And just before, sorry, I'm going to hold off even further getting to your paper, because there's interesting stuff in the existing literature. Mm-hmm. And I think it's useful to know that before we get into your contribution. So we know that there is this pattern where proportional systems tend to be associated with higher representation for women. And still not equal, but higher than we get under first past the post systems. Do we know why? Do we know what the underlying mechanisms are there?
So we have various ideas. Pinning down exactly what it is of course, challenging. But yeah, there are multiple hypotheses. So one hypothesis, for example, is that it's to do with the type of competition that we see under these two different systems. So under majoritarian systems, the idea is that this is a head-to-head competition, and it's been shown in both experimental and real-world settings that women tend to have an aversion to this type of head-to-head competition. And the idea is that this may reduce the number of women coming forward as candidates. There are numerous other mechanisms that have been hypothesized. So, for example, another is that under proportional representation systems, the parties themselves have incentives to ensure that they present a diverse ballot. The idea being that when you're showing, you're presenting your list of candidates, it's much more obvious than it would be in a kind of fragmented, split up majoritarian system with individual races, when you have a disproportionate number of men or women, because you're presenting precisely this list, and it's easy for voters to see when you have too many men, for example, or this also applies to minority groups. Similar in spirit to that argument is also the idea that under proportional representation systems, there's a higher district magnitude. So there are a greater number of seats available. And it's been argued that the deeper parties can pull from their lists, the more likely you are to get women, which is linked to the incumbency advantage. The idea that historically, because more men had been elected in politics, they would be more likely to be at the top of the list. And it's also true, finally, I could talk about this for much longer, but I'll try and just summarize it briefly. It's also easier in many ways to incorporate certain features into proportional systems, such as gender quotas. So having a fixed percentage of candidates, for example, who have to be of a given gender. And that's kind of easier to integrate into proportional representation systems than it is majoritarian systems.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So you've got some possible mechanisms there that are to do with candidates and who feels comfortable putting themselves forward as candidates. Then you have some mechanisms to do with voters and who or what lists voters are willing to vote for. So the argument there is that the voters might be a little bit prejudiced against women to the extent that if they're voting for a single candidate, then even if they're not kind of aware of their prejudice, they might find it more attractive to vote for a man than to vote for a woman. But if they're voting for a whole slate of candidates, then they're going to notice that a whole slate that is just men is obviously not fair and representative, and they're more likely to prefer a kind of balanced slate.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it has been shown quite convincingly, I would argue, in the literature that, in fact, voters tend not to be biased against women candidates. It tends to be more a problem of kind of institutional structural features that mean it's difficult for women. This is much broader than just politics as well, right? Like if we're talking about women's role in the workforce, welfare, maternity, like multiple institutional reasons for which women may not be able to come forward as candidates at the same kind of frequency as men. But on the whole, the literature would show that voters tend not to be biased against women. And indeed, so the mechanism I was talking about there is precisely on the ballots that you see in proportional systems, that you are more like voters respond well to having a diversity of candidates on there.
Fascinating. Great. So we know lots about the overall pattern, and we have some pretty good hunches, at least, about what are the underpinning mechanisms. So in your own research project, what was it that you wanted to add to that existing knowledge?
Yes, so as I mentioned before, there's a very big literature that tells us that it looks like proportional representation systems are more conducive to having higher female representation or women's representation than majoritarian systems. But much of this evidence was cross-national. And the problem or the challenge here is that there may be reasons for which countries choose certain electoral systems that are to do with their broader kind of cultural makeups that would influence both the choice of electoral system and the number of women that you see being elected. So what we wanted to do was to present causal evidence, or try to move towards causality, to show that it is in fact the electoral system and not some other broader cultural feature that increases women's representation in politics.
So we have here the idea that correlation does not prove causation, essentially. We need to go a bit deeper in order to identify whether there's really a causal mechanism from the electoral system to the levels of representation.
Yes, exactly. Great. And so because the existing literature was either cross-national, so as I just mentioned, you sort of don't have an idea of whether these institutions were instigated because of other cultural factors, or there were existing studies that kind of looked into pre and post reforms, but didn't have a within country counterfactual. So what we did is we came up with a research design that was within country. So that means that you can hold constant many of those cultural, institutional features that might influence women's representation, and you can essentially use what's known as a natural experiment to see whether it is the effect of the electoral rule itself that has this influence on women's representation.
So you use that phrase there, within country counterfactual, which some people will have understood and some people might have thought that's a bit bewildering. So essentially what you're saying here is that we've got elections to two kinds of bodies going on in the same country, and the electoral system changes for one of the bodies, but it stays the same for the other one, and therefore you're able to kind of compare these two in order to understand the impact that the electoral system change specifically is having.
Yes, exactly. So thank you, Alan. You just kind of, I think, summarized it very well. So what we do is we use the case of Italy, and it's a natural experiment. So what happens is that in 2005, there was an electoral reform at only the national level of government, and Italy has 4 different levels of government. So subnational levels, so the regions, the provinces, and the municipalities, and they were not affected by this reform of the electoral rule. So what we're able to do is leverage basically the sort of change over time in such a way as to estimate the effect of this reform, so the 2005 reform, on women's political representation. So the reform itself essentially moved the Italian national level of government from a mixed system that was 75% majoritarian and 25% PR, proportional representation, and moved it to a fully proportional representation system with closed lists. I can talk more about the details, but that's the kind of the key factor. So in 2005, there was this change in electoral system, and that's what we're focusing on. And essentially, what this does is it creates this natural experiment, as we called it before. And what we do is we use a quasi-experimental design called a difference and differences technique that essentially makes use of longitudinal data from these treatment and control groups. So as I just mentioned, the treatment group in this case is the national level of government, and the control group are the local, the subnational levels of government. And the differences or different diff technique is typically used to estimate these types of effects. So when you have some type of reform that changes something going on within your country, and you want to estimate the effect of that reform in your context of study. So the basic idea, I'm going to try and explain this as in the way that I find intuitive, at least, is that in the absence of treatment, so in the absence of the electoral reform in my case.
We should maybe just explain the the word treatment here, because it's quite an interesting word. So we're kind of coming from medical trials terminology, aren't we? And where you're testing out a drug, and you've got the drug and you're comparing it with a placebo. So that's your treatment, if you like. You're giving people the drug, or they're not really getting a treatment at all because they're just getting the placebo, and you're able to measure the effect. So that's why we use the terminology of treatments here.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Alan. You're right to sort of stop me there. So exactly, because we're talking about a natural experiment, we're using this type of language. So of treatment and control is precisely taken from this kind of medical type of vocabulary. So again, in this case, so the treatment is that level of government. So here in the national case, which was treated with the reform under study. So the change from the mixed system to the pure proportional representation system. And the idea is that essentially in the absence of treatment, the unobserved differences between the treatment and the control groups looks the same over time. So one of the main, it's called an identifying assumption, but that's kind of by the by, that's needed for this type of design, so the difference in differences, is precisely that there are parallel trends between the control group and the treatment group. So this means that they, over the years prior to the reform, move in the same direction. So they don't necessarily have to be at the same level, but they have to be moving in parallel. And then the idea is that when the reform hits, that only affects the treated group. And then what you can do is you can leverage the fact that they were moving in parallel previously to estimate the effect of the treatment only on the treated group, which is what you're interested in. I think, does that make sense?
Yeah, that's making sense. So you've got the two things, in this case, the national elections and the local and regional elections.
Mm-hmm.
They're going along in parallel before the reform, before the treatment.
Yes.
And then you have the treatment. So if suddenly they're not going along in parallel anymore, then you're thinking, well, that must be because of the treatment, because of the reform. Whereas if they do keep going along in parallel, then even if that's kind of a trend of change that they're both going through, the change is not kind of attributable to the reform, because you're able to strip out that kind of trend from the effect of the reform itself.
Exactly. Stripping out the trend it's a great way of putting it. And so the idea is that essentially if there weren't this reform, you would expect those trends to continue along in parallel.
Fantastic. So I love it when we get into methodology like this, because it sounds quite technical, and the language can be quite alien for people who are not used to it. But actually, in many ways, it's quite kind of intuitive, and it makes sense. So just
I think so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I think as long as, exactly, I don't know if I did a good job of it, but I think when it's explained well, often much of the intuition behind these types of, particularly these kind of quasi-experimental techniques are quite intuitive.
Yeah, great. So that's what you did. The key question then is, what did you find?
So thank you. That is indeed the key question. So what we found is precisely what we were expecting to find, which is that given the rich and vast literature that I mentioned before, suggesting that proportional representation systems were sort of foster higher women's political representation. And that's exactly what we find. So we estimate an effect of a 5% increase in women's national level political representation that comes with the reform. So just to reiterate, the reform from a mixed but mostly majoritarian system to a full PR system is associated with a 5% increase in women's political representation, according to our estimates.
That's great. So I guess one might think that with this kind of reform, it might take a while for changes to come through. It might be that you don't get an immediate effect, that rather things kind of emerge over time. I mean, is that what you see, or is there really an immediate effect that we see from one election to the next, essentially?
It is an immediate effect. Then, of course, there can be kind of consolidation effects, and you might see that increasing over time. But we do find that effect to happen immediately.
Great. So that's the core of your paper. But you also look at a second aspect of this. So you look not just at the relationship between the voting system and women's political representation, but you also look at how qualified the candidates are, and those who are elected. The candidates who are actually elected are. I mean, I guess the first question here is, what's the connection? Why is it relevant to be looking at that when fundamentally we're interested in understanding women's representation here?
That's a gregreat question. So, as we've established, there's a large literature that associates electoral rules with differing levels of women's representation. And there's also a large literature that also sort of associates different types of electoral rules with different kind of quality or qualifications of politicians. I'm going to use the word qualification because to talk about the quality of a politician is quite a difficult thing to measure. And so I'm going to use the word qualification, even if it's a little bit kind of clumsy, because I think it more kind of accurately describes what I'm going to be talking about here. And that's discussed a bit more kind of broadly in the paper. But there's also this literature that shows that the different types of competition associated with different electoral rules, so going back here again to majoritarian rules as opposed to proportional rules, are associated with different levels of qualification amongst politicians. At the same time, we also know from the literature more broadly that women politicians tend to be of a higher qualification level than men. So the idea when we kind of went into this project was to try and explore a little bit further this kind of counterbalancing effect that we might expect from a change in electoral rules. So the idea is that under majoritarian rules, because of the nature of competition, so it being head to head and being kind of focused on the characteristics of individual politicians rather than the party list more broadly, which is what we see under PR rules, is that you can get higher quality politicians. But what our hunch was is that because we expected the PR rule to bring more women in with it, we sort of expected that the increase in women politicians might help to kind of counterbalance this potential decrease that we would expect to see in the qualification of politicians that would come with a move to PR rules.
Great. And what did you find on this one?
So here I have to note we're moving to a more simple research design. We're not looking at the difference in differences estimation strategy anymore. So these are it's just suggestive evidence rather than causal evidence. So basically what we find is what we expected. So as we move from the majoritarian system to the proportional system, what we find is that our measures of qualification of politicians essentially remain constant, if not slightly increasing, but it's hard to kind of capture exactly what that means. So it seems like indeed the increase in women politicians is potentially associated with this kind of counterbalancing effect that reduces any negative impacts that might come with a switch to a proportional electoral system. We are able to kind of home in on that a little bit further for the election year of 2013, where we have data available also on candidates as well as elected politicians. And there, what we're able to show is that essentially there's a pool of higher quality women who remain in the candidate pool, so who are not elected. And the idea here is in line with existing literature that proportional systems are sometimes not fully able to select the very best candidates that are available. And the suggestion here is that if there are a way to kind of get these women elected, so out of the candidate pool and into the kind of elected pool, that we would perhaps see an increase, perhaps even in the quality of politicians overall.
So if I can just add up these various different effects in my mind and make sure I've got this right. So we know that proportional electoral rules are better for electing women. We also know, however, that in general, proportional rules are less good at electing highly qualified people. So if we want to have highly qualified politicians, then proportional rules are, other things being equal, less good. But actually, those two effects kind of add up to mean that overall, you don't have a diminution in the qualifications of people elected after the reform compared to before the reform, because you're getting more women and therefore they're kind of pulling up the qualification levels, if you like.
Yes, exactly. And this is very much in line. Thank you for summarizing that so nicely. I know there are lots of moving pieces. And this does actually fit in quite well with the broader literature that looks at quotas, for example. So the role of quotas in politics and how that affects the quality of politicians, and also more broadly, even on boards of companies, for example. Because often here there's an argument that, you introduce a quota, and because you have to kind of really scrape the barrel, you're not going to get equally good candidates. And that's been shown to be absolutely not the case. And in fact, women candidates are often more qualified than their male counterparts. So this kind of fits quite well in that kind of broader landscape of thinking about the quality of women candidates, specifically in the world of politics here.
Yes, good. So the counter argument to quotas that you sometimes hear is that they're getting in the way of meritocracy, essentially, that you're no longer simply appointing the best candidate or electing the best candidate in this case.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, you're showing that no, they're not doing that at all. They're countering a lack of meritocracy in the system already, that the system is already not adequately choosing better qualified women, and adjusting the system is going to help counter that inequality.
Yeah, exactly. And again, this is in the paper and is exploratory, sort of suggestive work rather than causal, but we also explore how these types of dynamics play out across the geography of Italy, which has very different gender norms, and we exploit that to try and get a little bit at what you were just talking about. So in areas where there are more traditional gender norms, what did the dynamics that we found look like? And we find, as we sort of would have expected, that they are worse. And the idea here is that so again, that means that we, in the candidate pool, we find more highly qualified women who somehow are they're not translated into elected figures. And the idea here, which is in line with existing literature, is it's called the sort of mediocre male leader, is the way that's written about in the literature. And the idea is that in these areas where you have sort of more gender traditional norms, male leaders in particular would be less keen on stronger women candidates coming forward, as that would potentially pose a threat to their leadership. And the idea is that they would therefore, like to have some women on board, but perhaps not the strongest candidates, as they would be more likely to challenge their power, essentially.
We could talk about this for much longer, but we have time for just one more question. So the evidence that you've got here is from Italy. To what extent do you think that your findings travel to other cases as well?
So this is always difficult to evaluate. So in this, one of the downsides, of course, of kind of focusing on a causal story is that you really focus in on your internal validity, so how much kind of sense your research design makes within itself. But that does come at the cost of how kind of your external validity, so the extent to which you think these findings would apply elsewhere. So one thing I would like to say is that I think Italy is, so in some ways it's seen as a kind of outlier amongst developed countries in terms of gender equality. It's not kind of super well known for being particularly gender equal. But that being said, in terms of kind of global rankings of gender equality, Italy is in many ways much more kind of representative than some of the countries on which much of the literature on women's representation in politics is based, which tend to be the Nordic countries, which is great because they have wonderful data and it means you can undertake these fantastic studies. But it does, I think, that is somewhat limited in that there's sort of gender norms, and even the institutions that we find in countries such as Iceland, Norway, and Finland are very different to many other countries in the world. And I think in many ways, Italy is more similar. So the kind of vast majority of countries, both in terms of gender equality and also in terms of the kind of the health of its democracy. It's been dubbed a flawed democracy, which means that it's characterized by the majority, in fact, of the world's democracies. So I think it's ultimately something that will be addressed by, I hope, other within country studies that can ask the same or similar questions. But I don't think it's unreasonable to expect similar effects to occur in other contexts.
Very good. There's always more research to be done.
Absolutely.
Ellie, thank you. It's been so interesting. I really like these episodes where we get to explore a really important question, but we also get to kind of tease apart the research process and understand just how we can do top quality research into these issues. So thank you so much. It's been fascinating.
Thank you.
And the article that we've been discussing is called Electoral Rules, Women's Representation and the Qualification of Politicians. It's by Paula Profeta and Eleanor F. Woodhouse. It's published in the journal Comparative Political Studies, so far in the online first section. And we will, of course, put all of those details in the show notes for this episode. We'll be back next week, as ever, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. But before I finish, let me add this week a special thank you. Abby Turner has been the producer of UCL Uncovering Politics since our very first episode 2 years ago. And she's done a fantastic job of organising, editing, uploading, publicising, and much else besides. Alas, however, this is her final episode as she moves on to pastures new. So, Abby, thank you. You've been terrific, and we wish you all the very best for the future. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer has been Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.